Alright, so this is video 1.3. It's going to be over domain and range notations. Previously with domain and range, we've simply just listed the x values or listed the y values. Here, we're going to be listing an interval, or what x or y value can be between for it to be true. It's for continuous graphs versus discrete graphs. All right, so we have three different notations. We have inequality, set, and interval. I put my favorite under interval because for this first test, we're going to be using all three notations. But then after this first test, we're going to switch, and I'm mostly going to use interval. If you prefer one of the other three, you can write whichever one you want. I don't care. But I'm going to use interval the most. So inequality notation you may be familiar with. I believe I've been told that you used it in Algebra 1 or Geometry. Whether that's true or not, who knows. But inequality notation is the most familiar because it's just like the inequality stuff we've always done. So we're going to have, I'm going to use an x. So if we were doing range instead of domain, we would be putting a y instead of an x. So it's really just whichever variable we're talking about. So in inequality notation, we're going to write the smallest number first. So if this was domain, we would say the smallest possible x value on the graph. And then x is going to be between the smallest possible x value and the largest possible x value. So it's kind of a range. Or an interval to where x is between these two numbers. And obviously the smallest number goes first, the largest number goes second, and then x is squeezed in between those. So inequality notation looks like that. And if we look at our cheat sheet on the bottom, if the graph has an arrow or an open circle, so an arrow would mean it went on forever, and an open circle, and we'll get to an example in a second, but we would use the not equal to inequalities, just the regular. If we have a closed dot on the graph, that means that point actually exists. So we're going to have a less than or equal to or greater than or equal to inequality. Set notation is kind of ugly. It starts with this stuff, and if that looks like Greek, it's because it is Greek. So in set notation, it always starts with this at the beginning. Then after this mess in the beginning, you just copy inequality notation. So set notation is inequality notation with that fancy stuff that I just wrote down at the beginning. So then we have the smallest number with x, and then the largest number, and then we finish off our squiggly bracket. So set notation, I put it next to inequality because it is the exact same thing as inequality, but it has that fancy stuff at the beginning. That stuff that I wrote at the beginning right here stands for, it says in English, if I was to translate that math to English, it says x, that up and down bar, that's not an L, that's a bar, like absolute value bar basically, means x such that x exists in the real numbers. So it just says that x is a number, which is obvious because we're looking at a graph, but it says x such that x exists in the real numbers. We're not going to write stuff this complicated most of the year. We will probably never use set notation after this, but if you take some upper level math classes and in college, you will see this all the time. So it's very popular in upper level classes. So we're just going to introduce you to it in Algebra 2. So interval notation you write parentheses or brackets. If we look at our cheat sheet, it has the inequality notation, then it has the word or. On the other side, we have parentheses or brackets. Parentheses are the things in the top row. Brackets are the things in the second row. So we'll have parentheses, and then its smallest number, comma, largest number. So all three of our notations have the same information. So they're all smallest to largest. But in interval notation, you just write the two numbers with parentheses or brackets around it. In inequality notation, you write the two numbers with an inequality in the middle. And set notation, you write inequality notation with a bunch of fancy stuff at the beginning. All right, so here it asks me to state the domain of the graph on the left in all three notations. So we'll start with inequality because hopefully that's the one we're most familiar with. So in inequality notation, domain is my x values. So I need to find what's my smallest x value and what's my largest x value that's possible on this graph. So if I'm looking for my smallest x, as I go left on my graph, I'm in negative numbers. As I go right on my graph, I'm in positive numbers. So obviously negative are smaller than positive. So my farthest left point is right there, and that's negative 4. So my smallest x value is negative 4. Then since we're doing domain, we're going to put an x in the middle. My largest x value is an arrow, which an arrow means that we go on forever. If we go on forever, that means we're never going to stop. And our math symbol for going on forever is called, I don't know if you've seen this before or not, infinity. And it's just a sideways 8, if you need to turn your paper sideways. So this arrow to the right means we go on to our positive x values forever. Our graph never stops. And if it never stops, the number for never stops is infinity. So when we switch to set notation, every time you do set notation, you just write all that stuff ahead of it. And obviously, if it was range, we'd just put a y instead of an x. That's the only difference. And then after we write all the fancy stuff, we just copy our interval notation. So it'd be negative 4x to infinity. So even if you're writing, oops, I need a squiggly bracket. So even if we're just writing all three notations, once you answer interval notation, you've answered all of them. The information is the same in all three notations, it's just different ways to write it. So in interval notation, and actually we need to go back and revisit inequality for a second. So if you look back at that cheat sheet, if you copied it down, I have a closed dot in the second row. So if I have a closed dot, if you look at inequality there, I need to put a line underneath that inequality. So if you have a closed dot on the graph, you need to put a line underneath your inequality. And on negative 4, right here, I have a closed dot. So that's why I need a line underneath my inequality. If you look at the top row, we have an arrow. And an arrow does not have a line underneath my inequality. So we won't put one next to infinity. And we can never touch infinity, so we'll never put a line underneath infinity. Interval notation, we know it's going to be negative 4, comma, infinity. Wow, Doceri desktop is right over that. Where can I write this? I'll do a different color so y'all can see it. We know it's going to be negative 4, comma, infinity. And if you look at that cheat sheet again, if you have a closed dot, we're going to put a bracket. And if you have an arrow or an open dot, we're going to put parentheses. So if you have a bracket that means you have a closed dot at that end. If you have an arrow or an open circle, we're going to put parentheses on that end. So here we have a different graph, and it asks me for the range of the graph in all notations. So in range, I'm looking at my y values, not my x values. So my y values are up and down. My lowest y value, so I'm looking at the very bottom point of my graph, is -2. My highest value is up there at 4. So in inequality, my smallest y value is -2. My highest y value is 4. And now I need to determine, do I need a line underneath my inequality symbol or not? So if you look at -2, down where I have a y value of -2, I do have a closed dot. So I need to put a line underneath. If you look at 4, I have an open dot. And if you look at the cheat sheet, an open dot, we will not put a line underneath. So when we do set notation of range, we will copy down this fancy stuff again, but again we'll change our x's to a y because we're talking about range. And then we will just copy our inequality notation. For interval notation, I'll use a different color because that dosary thing is right where I need to write. So inequality, we put the smallest number, interval, we put the smallest number first, largest number second. If you have a closed dot, we're going to put a bracket on that number. And if we have an open dot, we're going to put a parentheses on that number. So bracket is closed dot, open dot or arrow is a parentheses. All right, so those are your 3 notations. In class, we're going to get plenty of practice with domain and range.